Hello, I'm going to be going over styles. Many of us are going to be writing code, and one of the important things is to have a consistent style, mainly to not confuse students, but also simply to communicate more effectively, which is part of the same, right? I'm going to go ahead and go through the Airbnb JavaScript style guide. It's a widely used guide that's available online. You can download it from GitHub. You can see here the address at the top of the browser. And I'm going to go ahead and go through the guide. It's going to take a while, but I'll address most of the issues that we'll come up with and make comments on style. The reason I'm going through it all is because John and I make some distinctions. Overall, I think we come pretty close to what the guide does, but I wanted to highlight the things that we do differently. Along the way, you'll also get to see a lot of the different types of statements and expressions that can be made within JavaScript. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. To launch here, there's a few primitives that you can see: string, number, boolean, null, undefined. All of these are the only things that are not objects in the language. Everything else is an object, and in fact, several of these can have object wrappers that give it object-like behavior as well. So, very first thing, right off the bat, the way we declare variables within JavaScript, John and I, is we put a var in front of each variable name. So as opposed to doing what's being done here, where there's a comma and then the variable is defined in the next line, oftentimes you'll see a long chain of these separated by commas, regardless of type of what they may be used for. We opt for the more verbose style because we think it leads to clarity. A lot of the comments I will be making have to do with clarity. When we write code for ourselves is a good idea, but especially when we write code for others, that's even much more important. So maintenance is a huge component of the lifespan of a piece of code. So that's why many of the things that you'll see here as recommendations address that. This goes again to declarations. This is now looking at things that are definitely objects even without a wrapper. These are things like object, array, function. We'll get more into how to use this. We see here there's a couple of different ways of declaring objects. You can use this keyword new object. We never ever, John and me, never use the keyword new. We always use the array, the literal way of defining an object, as you can see here. I'll go ahead and give you a quick demo. I have the browser, here, but it's just in a different window. I'm going to go ahead and open up the console. So if I were to do something like var person and start to put in the two curly braces, you can see there that when I do that, I've already declared an object. I can start to add properties. So for example, if I said person email and I put in my email, I now have that within the object. Let's go ahead and give it one more. Let's say phone. And just for this example, let's put in, let's go ahead and put in a real one. And if I went back to person, you can see there that that is now part of the object. I can also now do person dot email. I get IntelliSense, as you can see, and I get back the value of this. So if we go back to the way it's declared, we always use what's called the literal translation. You can see here item equal to curly braces. That's denoting an object. Also, when it comes to reserved words, I think this one goes without saying. You don't want to use reserved words or things that are close to it. In this case, for example, they're using default and private, and below it's defaults and hidden. Don't use keywords. I think that's there's not much that needs to be said about that. Readable synonyms in place of reserved words. Again, this goes to style, clarity, trying to avoid making mistakes. Obviously, you don't want to do things like this. It just looks a bit weird. Again, we're trying to communicate more effectively in many of these constructs. Okay, arrays. Arrays. We had a discussion, John and I, shortly. He at times uses just array without the word new. We had some discussion on whether we would go to literal or not. He has written most of the array code, so I said I would start to use arrays if he was going to maintain that. That way I will match his style and not, sorry, there was somebody here at the door for a second, and not use the literal. But for the most part, I in the past have used the literal. This is a comment here when it comes to performance. This is something you never want to do. What is access the length of an array is part of computation. This is especially bad when it comes to for loops. If you're making the limitation of your for loop, the length of the array on every single loop, that will be calculated. If you have arrays, which at times you will, that are in the thousands or tens of thousands, that's a very expensive bit of computation. The best practice is to get the length in a line prior to that, put it into a variable, and then use that variable within the counter limit to be able to avoid that unnecessary computation. This is simply giving some recommendation when it comes to pushing into the array. Now, something else that you'll run into pretty quick is that whenever you assign an array to a new variable, it gets copied by reference. So if you thought you were working on two separate arrays, once you start to run the code, if you're lucky, it'll be pretty obvious that you're working on the same array and not on two separate ones. The way you make a copy of an array as opposed to a reference is you use items.slice. That gives you a copy that you can then modify independent of the original array. This is simply how to convert. By the way, I should also mention there's a couple of things that are pretty useful at times. Let me go ahead and declare an array. I will say numbers and create here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There is within the language something called a library called JSON, and we can use something called stringify. And if you ever want to print out your array, this does it in a pretty way. You can see there. You can also go the other way. I believe it's JSON parse. So if we did this, and let me see. I think so. If we did something like this, and you can start to see how you can change things here. If we did parse, let me see. I think I've lost the IntelliSense. Let me just try to do something simple first. Parse, and then put in stringify, and we might be able to come up with the object. I haven't tried this before. Let's see if this works. Okay, let's go ahead and hit test. Yeah, I've created an array. So you can see there what I've done. I've gone to the string and then back from the string into the array. Whenever you're picking up data from remote sites, oftentimes this is pretty useful. There's a few other methods in there that you might want to use as well. Okay, let's talk about strings. When it comes to strings, there are two ways in which you can denote a string. The first one is, let's do var my string, and you can do single quotes my string, and you can also do, obviously if we do my string, you'll get it back, and you can also do double quotes. You can see there's no difference. Now when it comes to style, the style we're adopting is that within the code, within JavaScript, the logic part of the page, we're going to use single quotes like it's shown here, where this is the good, single quotes, and the bad is double quote. We're making a distinction between this and HTML. So outside of your script block, and I'll make let me go ahead and make a simple example here of this would be the script block here within the page. This would be the HTML down here. So if I created a div here, that would be my HTML. And so if I did ID, and we discussed using capitals for this, but you can see there that I would use quotes. So let's say that we wanted to call this target. This is double quotes. Anything that you use inside of the script here. So if you did var my string equal to, well, press the wrong one. This would be my string. Inside of the script, in the JavaScript block, we use single quotes. Outside of it, we use double quotes. So let's go ahead and go back to the style guide. And this is simply addressing things, again, for clarity, to try to avoid errors. The recommendation is to use plus and concatenation and go multi-line as opposed to trying to use escape characters and other techniques. Let's take a look here at this. Is again talking about strings and some recommendations. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take a look at functions. The way in which we define a function, both of us are using the variable declaration. So if we go back to this, I will do the add function. I will call a function here, and here you can we're doing it, well, in some of these I hesitate because I'm not sure if we're both doing the same thing, but I think most of the time both of us are doing this. So I'll point out exactly what I mean by this in a moment. Let me just finish up this function. I will do A and B here. Let me go ahead and hit return. Well, before I do that, let me call that out, the difference. If you see here, my function on the right-hand side does not have a name. I can do this, and I can do it without. So let me go ahead and do it this way, and I will add two numbers, 1, 1. You can see there that I get 2. If I go back to the declaration and I remove this, you can see there that I've made the same definition again. If I do 1, 1, you see that I get the same result. What is the difference? The difference comes into play if you're tracking your errors through a stack trace. If you're going pretty deep into the stack trace, having a name on the function as opposed to it being an anonymous function is a useful thing. Typically, we won't be getting in that deep. Many times I omit it unless I think it's something that I'm going to be debugging at a pretty low level. So for the most part, both of us are using this form where we omit the name. Okay, let's see what else is here. This is just talking about the way of making the definitions. This is a list of statements here, some styles, not too much to comment on this. Let's get to properties. When it comes to properties, both of us, this is the way in which to declare an object, as I said previously. Let me go ahead and move to that page. I believe we could go back to person. So you can access person, let me see, I have email this way, or you can do person in parentheses and then type email like this. We do the dot notation. I think we both prefer it. But in addition to that, the second form is more error bound. Whenever you have to type something over the course of thousands of times, you're going to make mistakes. So using the dot notation with the variable name is a better technique simply because you're minimizing on errors. Here's the property, you get access to it. At times, the recommendation that this guide does, and this is something that I don't do very often but makes sense, is that if you're using a variable to access a property, then you can use it within the brackets. And that's, again, that makes sense because that variable, the value would have been passed in, you're not typing it in. So you're avoiding those errors. Okay, let's take a look when it comes to variables, what the recommendations are. Within this style guide, you can see here that they're always recommending to use var in front of your variable name. This goes, well, let me explain the reason for this. The reason is that if you don't, it goes into the global scope, and you end up with a global variable. I think all of you know why global variables are not a good idea, so I'm not going to say much more than that. You want to avoid them, so you always want to put var in front of your variable name. So that's enough said about that. You can see here, here they're talking again about declarations. In this case, we do the opposite. They're saying don't do every single line with var. We are doing precisely that. We think it reads better. We think it's clearer, as opposed to doing something like this where you put everything into the same line. And some of these go on for quite a bit. There's a recommendation to declare unassigned variables last. This is purely a style decision. I don't feel strongly one way or another. It seems to make sense. There's just less things there. I think I tend to do that intuitively, but we don't feel strongly one way or another. When it comes to assigning variables, the recommendations within functions is to do it at the top, right after you start the function. This has to do with things like hoisting. I won't get into that at the moment. It's some scary things that happen within the language, but let's leave that for another time. For now, I think everybody does that anyway at the beginning of the function. As you start, you declare what you're going to use within the function, write your variables, and that's a good practice. That's simply going through this. Hoisting, like I mentioned, this is some unusual behavior that you get within JavaScript. I'll cover that at a different time. Conditional expressions. When it comes to this, one of the things that you want to ensure is that you're always very explicit within this language. This language can work with a lot of imprecision. Some of this has to do with the people that were writing code at the beginning of the web. Just like HTML is pretty fault tolerant, some of the intent of the original designers of the language is for the language to be pretty fault tolerant. The problem with that is that many times you get widely unexpected behavior, and it really causes you a lot of grief. So the one thing that I would recommend very strongly is that you're very specific about the brackets that you use and about the computation that you're trying to carry out. So always put in semicolons at the end of your instruction. Always use brackets, curly brackets, if you're doing a conditional, if you're doing a loop, and so on. Some of the other things that are being addressed here is the issue of what do you use inside a conditional statement. Obviously, if you can get it into a form as the middle one here, where you have a nice cleaner expression, many times these are, for example, if valid, and valid can have the value of true or false. That reads a lot better than if you do something like if name is not equal to empty string. In this case, we can come back to the issue of empty strings because there's null, empty string, and undefined, but we can address that at another time. Here is simply talking about style. If you can represent it in the cleaner, more readable form, of course, that's a good idea. Again, this is something that I mentioned should not be done for performance reasons. This is again addressing what I just mentioned about blocks. Make sure you're very clear about what your block of computation is. This is also recommending that, so for example, in this case, this statement works, right? And it doesn't have the braces. It even works if you leave out the semicolon. You don't want to do that, okay? You want to be verbose like this. I would say even this is a bad practice. Again, you want to make very sure that what you're writing, especially when it comes to writing for a class, be very, very explicit about what you're trying to do. Comments. There's a number of ways in which you comment. I think these are the exact same ones as in Java. You make double slashes for things that are going to be commented in a line or two. You use the slash asterisk if you're going to make a long set of comments. The other thing that I'll mention is when you see this add param, string, tag, etc. This is used for tools that do automatic documentation. As usual, you would have the parameters, a description of what this function is doing, and then you would have an example on how to use the code. Typically then you would have some tool rip through all of your code and generate automatic documentation that could be used. So that's it about comments. You can see here a lot of this has to do simply with readability. Okay, that's all comments. White space doesn't matter. You can have as much or as little as you like. John and I were having a discussion last night. We tend to use what the editor gives us. Typically that is 2 spaces. At times it will be 4. We tend to not fight it too much, so we'll have either 2 or 4. The point here is to be consistent. If you see indenting at the same level throughout the code, it communicates something. Also, if you have something indented 4 or 5 levels deep, it should mean something as well. So be consistent with your spacing, use it for clarity. A lot of times you can use it as well to line up your code so that your declarations are clearer. And there are some plugins that I'll mention when I talk about the editor that help you do that automatically. Okay, so this is simply some more spacing. This is some rules here about what spacing you put in your operators. I tend to use this form here. We don't feel that strongly, John and I, about the spacing you use. I think this one's more readable. When it comes to doing things like loop declarations, for loops where there's not a lot of room, I will at times collapse the space between my operators, especially in that for loop first term. You have a first term where you initialize your counter typically. You have your second term where you do your comparison to see if you're going to continue looping, and then you have your increment on the third term usually. A lot of times there's not a lot of room there, and I tend to compact them, meaning not have space, but we don't feel that strongly about that. I think this one reads better, so I agree with the guide. More comments. This is one that you shouldn't do. You shouldn't write code like this. You can see here this long string of properties and functions within objects. There's many ways to avoid this. If you do happen to end up in this situation, it is much better to do a hierarchy, a flat hierarchy like this, where every level, I was mentioning last night that you can think of this as level 1, level 2, and you could continue here, level 3, level 4, and it's pretty readable. You can see what is happening. Still, as I mentioned at the beginning, you shouldn't be doing this in the first place. You can see here a larger function that is doing a lot of the same. When it comes to commas, we don't use this type of declarations, as I mentioned, so I think this point is moot. When it comes to declaring objects, we use what this guide considers to be good. As you can see here, we put the commas on the right hand side as opposed to on the left hand side. I think that's more readable. The other thing that we would do here is typically, if you're using the plugin, you can simply align these values for each of these properties automatically. Let's see what else. This is simply looking here at additional examples with arrays, and I think that's all we have to say about that. Let me make sure that there's not something else missing here. I have hero, first name, last name, and this is, I think this has to do with plural versus singular. Well, no, I'm not sure exactly what the point is between these two. Let me see. Variable hero, open, first name. Kevin, comma, oh, that trailing comma at the end. I think that's what they're talking about, whether you put a trailing comma at the end. Some of these might be very fine a point. I tend to not do it. At times I'll miss one where I had an additional property and I just forgot to delete it. I don't think that's an issue, a major issue. Obviously you don't need it there at the end, so you could take it off. The other point is to always end your object declarations here with a semicolon, as you can see, and the same thing. So even if you're going multi lines and the language again will pick it up, you don't want to have surprises, so make sure you finish that up. So semicolons, this is precisely the point that I was just mentioning. Here is a statement that is valid. It would be better if you had a semicolon. And if you start to use the plugins that I'll mention on another recording, you can simply turn on the linter, and the linter will give you a hard time if you don't put in those semicolons. Typecasting and coercion, this is something that we don't do, so I'll go ahead and skip over this. Naming conventions, this is something that people struggle with at first. They will use the worst type of variable names you can imagine. The clearer you can be, the more you can express your intent as a programmer, especially for those who are going to be reading your code, the better it will be. So obviously things like function Q or function A or function 1, function 2, function 3 are things that do not communicate very well. So that is something that you shouldn't do. The other thing is if you're going multiple words, we use camel casing. That's the first word in lowercase, and every single word after that, starting the first letter of that would be capitalized. So you can see here an example where it says this is my object, and you can see there the camel casing. Obviously this is just wrong. Some more comments about naming. I think those are the big things. Name your functions. This is what I was talking about before. Precisely the same comment I made. This is helpful for stack traces. When it comes to accessing functions for properties are not required. This has to do with style. There's, I think, a couple of camps, as I was saying previously in a previous recording. There's the get and set crowd, and then there's the CRUD, which is create, read, update, and delete. I think neither of us are very strict about how we use that. I think all we're worried about is being clear in our intent and what we're trying to communicate. And I think if you use these, you can certainly get some additional consistency. But I think as long as you're clear about what those functions or those accessors or those methods are doing, that's good enough. Constructors. I'll skip over this because this has to do with how do you create prototypes, and I'll leave that's more not prototypes. I take that back. Of how do you create new objects? This would be the equivalent of having classes and instances of classes and things like C or C#, but or Java for that matter. But this is something we'll come back to. We don't use constructors is the thing to note at this point. We create objects on the fly and return them from methods. But we'll talk more about that in a separate podcast. When it comes to events, this is also another advanced topic. We'll come back to this one as well. Modules, this has to do with namespacing and how do you create some space, some area and where you make sure you don't have collisions when it comes to variables. This is something, again, that we'll come back to. jQuery, this isn't something we're not going to use. We might do a class where we talk about libraries, and in that class we can certainly touch on jQuery. It is incredibly useful if you're touching or manipulating the UI. This is the HTML elements in a heavy way. A lot of the visualization that we will be doing, we will do on Canvas. We will also use some other packages for geospatial, but those we will use the functions within that package directly. So we've come to the end of the style guide. This is sort of a marathon of style concerns that we have and practices John and I both follow. You can see here that we're pretty close to the style guide, but not 100%. I think the biggest difference we have is on variable declarations and a few things here and there. But other than that, I think this is a pretty good style guide. So I'm going to go ahead and share this with you. If you have any comments, we can follow up offline. Okay, thanks, bye.